They say there is a kind of madness that only the most gifted souls can bear, the madness of wanting more than what the world will allow. For most, that hunger burns quietly, hidden behind civility, ambition disguised as virtue. But in rare men, it becomes something divine and dangerous. The poets call it hybris, the fever that drives mortals to test the heavens. And at its heart stood a name once sung through the valleys of Greece, Bellerophon, the man who tried to conquer Olympus itself. Before the songs and the marble statues, before the myths carved him into the shape of a hero, he was merely a man. And like all men who rise too high, his story began with a question that should have never been asked. If the gods grant us greatness, why do they deny us the sky? It was said that when he fell, the gods did not curse him. They did not strike him with thunder or cast him into Tartarus. They simply turned their faces away. In that silence, that divine indifference, lay a punishment far colder than wrath. His name would echo in both triumph and warning, a lesson whispered through the ages. But to understand how he came to reach for Olympus, one must look back. To the blood that shaped him, to the inheritance that bound him to both glory and ruin. For Bellerophon's story was not born from chance. It was carved from a lineage that defied the gods and paid for it in eternity. Long before his wings of white carried him through the clouds, he walked the marble halls of Corinth under another name, Hipponus, a prince of quiet promise. His father was Glaucus, king of that proud city, a ruler of merchants and horsemen. Yet the true weight of his heritage came not from his father's crown, but from his grandfather's curse. For his grandfather was none other than Sisyphus, the trickster king who outwitted death and forced even the gods to kneel in frustration. The man who tried to cheat the order of the universe and found himself condemned to roll a stone for eternity. Bloodlines in the world of the Greeks were never merely history. They were prophecy. The temperament of ancestors was thought to flow like a current through the veins of their descendants. If Sisyphus had defied Olympus, perhaps his grandson might one day do the same. And so from birth, Hipponus bore not only noble privilege, but divine suspicion. He grew into a youth of striking form, tall, broad-shouldered, his bearing calm yet unyielding. There was a steadiness in him that set him apart from the restless violence of other princes. When he spoke, his words were measured, his gaze unwavering. People said he carried respect the way others carried armor, but beneath that composure, a hunger was forming. The hunger to be tested, to prove that his worth was not confined to the mortal ground. Then came the mistake. The moment that cracked open his fate. The stories differ. Some say it was an accident, a spear thrown astray in a hunt that struck a man named Bellerus. Others whisper it was murder, a quarrel born of pride. The truth, like much of legend, has been worn smooth by retelling. But the consequence was the same. Blood demanded atonement, and exile became his only path. From that moment, Hipponus ceased to exist. He took upon himself the name of the man he had slain, Bellerophon, the slayer of Bellerus. It was a name both confession and prophecy, a reminder that the price of destiny is always blood. He wandered through the lands of Greece, a fugitive prince haunted by the shadow of his lineage and the weight of his crime. Yet even in disgrace, he carried himself like one touched by something greater. Kings saw it in him. That quiet gravity that makes men listen before they understand why. And so, fate led him to the gates of Tiryns, ruled by King Proetus, a man of cunning mind and cautious rule. According to the customs of Xenia, the sacred bond between guest and host, Bellerophon sought purification for the blood he had spilled. This was no mere ritual. It was a plea to both men and gods to cleanse his hands of guilt. Proetus agreed, performing the rites and welcoming him into his court. For a time, peace seemed possible. The wandering prince found favor among nobles, his demeanor earning admiration. Yet the higher he was raised, the nearer he drew to the edge once more. For within the palace, beneath the shimmer of feasts and music, waited another test, one that would turn hospitality into betrayal and redemption into doom. But that would come later. For now, Bellerophon stood on the threshold between worlds, forgiven in name, but not yet in spirit. Above him, the sky stretched wide and indifferent, as if already sensing the shape of his ambition. In the quiet of Tiryns' night, as torches flickered against the stone, he would sometimes lift his eyes toward Olympus. There, beyond the reach of mortal kings, burned the promise of immortality. Cold, beautiful, unreachable. And in that unreachable light, something in him stirred. Because for some men, the world itself is never enough. In the years that followed his arrival in Tiryns, Bellerophon carried himself like a man trying to forget who he had been. Yet destiny does not forgive forgetfulness. It waits, silent as breath. Within the marble halls of King Proetus, the Prince Aias exile found temporary peace. But peace in a royal court is the most fragile illusion of all. The Queen of Tiryns, known to some as Antea, and to others as Sthenoboia, soon became a shadow in his story. Some say she looked upon him with desire, others with jealousy and malice. Whatever her motive, the result was the same. One day she whispered poison into the ear of her husband, claiming that Bellerophon had sought to dishonor her, to turn the sanctity of guest law into scandal. To kill a guest outright would have been to break Xenia, that sacred bond guarded by Zeus himself. But to ignore a queen's accusation would risk rebellion within his own house. And so, the king did what clever men often do when fear and honor pull in opposite directions. He let another bear the guilt. Proetus called Bellerophon to him with measured courtesy, spoke of alliances and diplomacy, and handed him a sealed letter. Within its wax lay the sentence of death, written in the king's own hand: "Kill the bearer of this note." The letter was to be delivered to Iobates, ruler of Lycia, Proetus' father-in-law. And so the exile became a messenger. Bellerophon left Tiryns with gratitude in his heart and a noose in his hands, unaware that the parchment tucked inside his cloak had already decided his fate. He crossed the Aegean, guided by stars and silence, toward a land of rugged mountains and red earth, a kingdom that stood at the edge of the known world. When he reached Lycia, King Iobates received him with open arms. Hospitality was sacred, and strangers of noble bearing were rare. For days the halls were filled with feasts and laughter, the air perfumed with wine and roasted lamb. Only when the third sun rose did Iobates finally break the seal. The ink glimmered dark under torchlight. He read the words once, twice, then folded the letter carefully, the smile on his face unchanged. To kill a guest under his roof would invite Zeus's wrath, and no man, not even a king, would dare invite that. Yet, to defy Proetus, his powerful son-in-law, would invite mortal ruin. Thus, he devised a compromise worthy of Olympus itself. If he could not kill the man, he would let fate do it for him. In the highlands of Lycia, there lived a creature the world had long since abandoned to nightmares: the Chimera. Born of Typhon's monstrous brood, its body was a riddle of beasts, the fore of a lion, the midsection rising into a goat's snarling head, the tail ending in a serpent that hissed with venom. Its breath was fire, its hunger endless. Soldiers had gone to slay it and never returned. The very earth around its lair was blackened, the air warped by heat. The king's order came simple and clean: kill the Chimera. It was an impossible task, cloaked in honor, a death sentence hidden in a hero's challenge. But Bellerophon did not protest. Perhaps he saw through the trap and accepted it anyway. Or perhaps he still believed that destiny could be bargained with through courage alone. Either way, he bowed his head and prepared for war. In those quiet hours before dawn, as he gathered his weapons, the thought of facing the fire-born monster must have felt like staring into the eyes of his own curse, the reflection of every sin that had followed him since Corinth. A lesser man would have prayed for mercy. Bellerophon sought a weapon instead. He had heard whispers of a creature that might match fire with flight: Pegasus, the winged horse born from the blood of Medusa. None had ever tamed it. The stallion was said to live by the spring of Pyrene in Corinth, where the waters shimmered like mirrors beneath the sun. It was said that even the gods admired its beauty but dared not claim it. So he prayed. Some say he knelt before Athena's altar for days until exhaustion blurred into trance. Others claim that the goddess came to him in a dream, her voice ringing like the strike of bronze on bronze. When he awoke, a golden bridle lay beside him, gleaming in the first light of morning. That gift, subtle, divine, luminous, was more than a tool. It was permission. When he returned to the spring, the winged horse stood waiting. Its coat shone like foam, wings folded like the sails of a sleeping ship. Step by step, Bellerophon approached, speaking low and steady, the way only true horsemen do, with patience measured in heartbeats. When the bridle touched Pegasus's neck, the stallion did not rear or flee. It bowed. In that moment, mortal and divine bound themselves in a single breath. The exiled prince and the creature of gods, man and myth, united by a whisper of trust. Mounted on Pegasus, the world below seemed suddenly small. The valleys and seas that had once caged him now spread like a map beneath his feet. And in the rush of wind and feathers, in the fierce joy of rising where no man had risen, he might have felt it. The first taste of the madness that would one day undo him. For now, though, the skies belonged to him, and with them, the promise of a battle that could either cleanse his name or end it forever. The morning Bellerophon rode Pegasus into the mountains of Lycia, the world seemed both impossibly vast and painfully fragile. Below him, the valleys stretched in waves of ochre and green. The wind carried the scent of ash and distant thunder. And somewhere ahead, beyond the black ridges where the air shimmered with heat, lay the Chimera, breathing flame into the dawn. From the air he could see where it had passed. The fields were scarred in circles of soot. The bones of cattle and men lay buried in glassy soil. Once verdant villages had turned to skeletal remains, fire-petrified ghosts of homes that would never cool. The Chimera was not just a beast. It was a wound carved into the earth, a living memory of chaos. Pegasus's wings cut the wind with a rhythm like thunderclaps. Bellerophon gripped the golden bridle, feeling the pulse of divine energy run through his hands. He had ridden horses all his life, but never one that seemed to move between heartbeats. It was as if the creature flew not through air, but through thought itself. And yet, even as the horizon trembled in the heat, the man on its back remained steady. When they found the beast, it was feeding. The lion's head tore into the carcass of an ox, while the goat's head bleated and spat smoke, and the serpent tail writhed restlessly in the dust. Its body was an anatomy of nightmares, muscles shifting beneath patchwork hide, claws gouging stone, every exhale laced with embers. Pegasus circled high above, casting a shadow that rippled across the ground. The Chimera lifted its heads to the sky, all three at once, and the air vibrated with its roar. Fire rose in a column so fierce that the air itself screamed. Bellerophon leaned low against the horse's neck, feeling the heat pass beneath them like a river of molten air. He steadied his breathing. The spear in his hand gleamed dully, its tip wrapped in lead, a trick whispered to him in dreams. Against a monster that turned air to fire, iron would only melt. Lead would do more. It would flow. He let the Chimera strike again, once, twice, measuring the arc of its flame, the delay between its breaths. The beast was power, but it was also rhythm, and rhythm could be broken. Pegasus banked sharply left. The rush of air cooled his face, cutting through the heat. The third blast came. Bellerophon saw it before he felt it, a bright bloom that devoured the world in gold. He urged Pegasus upward, climbing fast, out of reach. Then, silence. The kind of silence that waits before something ends. He turned in the air. The spear left his hand like a shard of light. It struck deep into the lion's open mouth. The Chimera's fire met the lead, and in that collision of heat and metal the weapon turned liquid, molten death pouring into the creature's throat. It reared, convulsed, the roar twisting into a gurgle. Smoke and flame burst from every wound as it collapsed, shaking the mountain beneath. Pegasus wheeled once more, circling above the dying monster. Below, the Chimera's body twitched, then stilled. The air, once thick with smoke, cleared to a strange blue calm. Only the faint hiss of cooling stone remained. For a long moment, Bellerophon said nothing. He simply breathed, feeling the pulse of Pegasus beneath him, the tremor of his own heart echoing it. Victory had a sound. It was not applause or song. It was the slow exhale after survival. When he returned to Iobates, the court erupted in awe. The impossible had been done. Yet the king's astonishment curdled quickly into unease. This man had been sent to die, and had returned crowned by the gods. What king could command a hero the gods themselves seemed to favor? So he smiled, offered wine, and quietly planned again. A second challenge followed. The Solymi, mountain warriors fierce as the land that bred them. They fought with bronze and stone, ambushing travelers from crags above. Bellerophon accepted the charge with calm certainty, and once again, Pegasus turned the high ground against them. From above, the hero rained arrows and javelins with surgical precision. The Solymi fell like broken shadows upon the rocks. Still, the king was unsatisfied. He sent him next against the Amazons, warrior women whose shields shone like mirrors beneath the sun. They met him in formation, an army of symmetry and discipline. Their arrows filled the air, a dark storm aimed at the sky. But Pegasus flew through that storm like light through rain. Bellerophon struck from above, breaking their ranks, scattering the line until the queen herself raised the horn of retreat. The more he triumphed, the quieter his victories became. Praise began to sound like prophecy. The Lycians called him blessed of Athena. Some whispered that he was no longer fully mortal, that the blood of Poseidon burned too brightly in his veins. And yet, each triumph carried a shadow. The king's fear deepened. Men of lesser courage spoke of betrayal. And in the hush between battles, Bellerophon began to hear something else. Not voices, not prayers, but the strange, beckoning hum of the sky itself. He had ridden above the clouds. He had looked down upon the world as if from the eyes of the gods. And once a man has seen that view, how can he ever be content to walk the earth again? He did not yet know it, but the war within him had already begun. The spear that had killed the Chimera had also struck something inside him. A hunger for more than victory, for more than mortal praise. It was the echo of his grandfather's defiance, carried in his blood like a secret inheritance. And so the sky waited, patient, eternal, watching him rise higher with each triumph, knowing how every ascent ends. The years that followed were a golden age in Lycia. The people sang Bellerophon's name as though it were a prayer answered. In the marketplace, children reenacted his battles with wooden sticks for spears. Warriors invoked his courage before setting out to war. Even kings from distant lands sent messengers to behold the man who had tamed Pegasus and slain the unkillable. And yet every story of triumph carries its own curse. The higher one rises, the closer one stands to the fire. King Iobates, who had once plotted his death, could no longer deny the hand of the gods in his survival. After the Amazons' defeat and the rout of Lycia's fiercest warriors, the king bent to what he could not destroy. He offered his daughter, Philonoe, to Bellerophon as bride, binding him not as enemy, but as heir. Lands were granted, titles bestowed, songs written. The exile of Corinth became the prince of Lycia. For a time, harmony ruled. The hero governed with wisdom and restraint. A soldier's discipline turned toward peace. He was patient in judgment, generous in reward, feared only for his clarity of command. Pegasus, too, was often seen grazing on the palace fields, his wings folded like a great white banner of divine favor. It seemed as though heaven itself had forgiven the mortal who once carried guilt on his shoulders. But men who touch the heavens seldom forget the feeling. The poets say it began with a whisper, not from gods, but from within. Each festival, each hymn in his honor, each voice that called him favored of Athena, pressed upon the fragile balance between reverence and pride. When he knelt at the altar to offer thanks, he sometimes found himself hesitating, not out of doubt, but out of a strange question that would not fade. Why must man always kneel? He had seen the gods' indifference. He had watched them stay silent as men burned and prayed. He had done deeds no god dared descend to do. And as the memory of fear dimmed, glory began to feel like entitlement. The same courage that once drove him to survive began to whisper of conquest. Bellerophon's victories had become legend, but legends are dangerous things. They harden into mirrors that reflect not who you are, but who you begin to believe yourself to be. When his soldiers looked upon him, they no longer saw a man. They saw an idea, something half mortal, half divine. And when the world treats you like a god, it becomes difficult to remember how to be human. It was said that at night he would climb the palace terraces and watch the stars until dawn. Pegasus would stand nearby, restless, feathers gleaming in moonlight. The bond between them, once forged in humility, began to strain under the weight of his ambition. The king, now aging, saw the change, but dared not speak it aloud. He owed his throne to this man, yet feared what his power might become. The priests murmured of omens, of strange winds and restless birds. But Bellerophon paid no heed. He had conquered beasts and armies. What threat could whispers pose? And still the question grew. If the gods truly favor me, why do they not welcome me among them? He began to speak less of ruling and more of destiny. When he addressed his men, he no longer spoke of Lycia or of peace, but of glory that reached beyond death. He wore his victories like armor, and his silence like a crown. The line between reverence and arrogance had blurred beyond sight. The same word that once meant hero now hovered dangerously close to blasphemer. For those who watched him, the transformation was both awe and dread. To see a man so elevated was to witness beauty at the edge of disaster, a star burning too bright to last. And perhaps in his own heart, he already sensed it. There are moments, historians say, when Bellerophon's eyes would lift toward the heavens and go still, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. Maybe it was the echo of his grandfather Sisyphus, still straining beneath his endless stone. Maybe it was the wind over Pegasus's wings, calling him back to where his story began. The sky. When the idea finally came to him, it felt less like rebellion and more like inevitability. He would not just ride Pegasus across the skies, he would ride him to Olympus, to stand before the gods, to claim his place among them, not as supplicant, not as worshipper, but as equal. In the halls of his palace, surrounded by gold and praise, the hero who had once knelt in humility now rose in silence, convinced that the same heavens which had lifted him would never let him fall. But the sky, unlike men, has no memory. They say the morning of his final flight dawned clear and cold. The sea below Lycia shimmered like hammered bronze. Mist clung to the mountains, veiling the world in a hush that felt like waiting. Bellerophon rose before sunrise, alone. No guards, no attendants, not even the queen who had once sworn to follow him anywhere. Only Pegasus stood with him in the pale light, wings half unfurled, restless, as though the creature already knew that this journey would not end in triumph. There was no armor on his shoulders, no spear, no shield. The bridle of gold gleamed faintly in his hands, the last gift of a goddess whose favor he was about to betray. He looked toward the east, where the first light spilled over the hills, and whispered something only the wind could hear. Then, with a single motion, he mounted. Pegasus surged forward, hooves striking sparks from the stone. The ground fell away, replaced by the rolling blur of fields, rivers, cities. The air thinned, the sun rose higher. Lycia became a memory, then a shape, then nothing. For a while, there was only the sound of wings. The higher they climbed, the quieter the world became. The wind no longer roared, it hummed, The clouds turned from white to gold, then to a blue so deep it felt endless. The world below faded into mist, and the sky above began to feel almost solid, like glass that might shatter if he touched it. Bellerophon's thoughts were calm, not proud, not afraid, simply resolved. He had faced monsters, armies, and kings. He had defied death itself. Was this not what the gods desired? Courage beyond fear, will beyond reason. He had given the world everything a mortal could offer. Surely the heavens owed him acknowledgement. Below him, Pegasus's breath grew heavy. Frost gathered along the bridle. The air no longer fed their lungs, but burned them. Still he urged the horse higher, past the veil of cloud, where sunlight fractured into prisms. He looked for the shining gates of Olympus, the immortal peaks where feasts never ended and the gods ruled in laughter and lightning. But there was nothing. No gate, no throne, no music. Only sky. The emptiness unsettled him more than any roar of thunder could have. It was as if Olympus itself refused to exist for him. Or perhaps it was never there to begin with. "Show yourselves," he might have whispered. "I have earned this." The answer was silence. Some say Zeus, from his throne unseen, sent a gadfly to sting Pegasus, a mere breath of divine will. Others believe Pegasus himself rebelled, sensing that a mortal hand no longer had the right to command him. Whatever the truth, the moment came like the breaking of a string. Pegasus shuddered mid-flight. The golden bridle snapped taut, then slipped from Bellerophon's grasp. For one suspended heartbeat, man and horse were weightless, caught between heaven and earth, between dream and consequence. Then the balance broke. The sky tilted. The wind turned cruel. Pegasus twisted upward and away, wings beating once, twice, before vanishing into the blinding light. Bellerophon fell. The air tore past him, cold and endless. The earth rushed up with impossible speed. There was no thunder, no divine voice, no punishment from above, only the indifference of gravity and the echo of his own heartbeat. When he struck the ground, the world flashed white. He lived, if it could be called living. Crippled, blinded by pain, his body broken, he wandered the land he had once ruled. The songs that once praised his name fell silent. Kings turned away. Even the priests, who had once blessed him as the favored of Athena, now crossed themselves at his approach. No bolt of lightning had found him, no fire from the heavens, only the quiet cruelty of being ignored. The gods, it seemed, had not destroyed him. They had simply forgotten him. In time, even he forgot the sound of wings. Pegasus, freed of mortal burden, was lifted into Olympus. There, the stallion was yoked to Zeus's chariot and became the bearer of thunderbolts, a symbol of divine strength untainted by pride. In the skies, his silhouette glimmered among the constellations, eternal and serene. Below, Bellerophon dragged his broken body through the dust, nameless and unseen. Farmers offered him pity, sometimes bread, never recognition. The once hero of Greece lived out his days whispering to the air, perhaps to the gods, perhaps to the memory of the horse that left him behind. When death finally came, it was gentle. The earth he had spurned took him back, and the winds carried his name not as song, but as sigh. And yet, the story endured. The poets remembered both halves of him, the glory and the fall. One voice told of the man who tamed Pegasus, slew the Chimera, and rose above every fear that chained mankind. The other voice told of the fool who mistook divine favor for divine kinship, whose punishment was not wrath, but absence. Because the gods, in their silence, revealed something that mortals often forget. Not all denial is hatred. Sometimes, indifference is the truest form of judgment. In every age, his tale returns, a mirror held before those who reach too high. His courage inspires, his pride warns, and between the two lies the fragile thread that binds mortal to divine. When the wind moves through the mountains of Lycia, it carries a faint sound, a whisper like wings against the sky. Some say it is Pegasus, still circling the heavens. Others say it is Bellerophon's soul, forever gazing upward, forever hearing only silence in return. And perhaps that is the lesson he left us, that the greatest punishment is not to fall, but to rise so high that there is no one left to hear you when you call for help. The sky remains what it has always been, vast, beautiful, indifferent.